Ah, the tempo. It starts before the beginning. It starts with an upbeat. And even if it starts with a downbeat, there is an inertia that is initiated before the music starts. That's what the conductors do, pulling the musicians who play towards the next beat while they play the preceding one, a bit like what you should do in sight reading. Train yourself to read the beat ahead. Always be in anticipation. And then take incredible advantage of the rests. That's something that students rarely do, even if they can intellectualize it on the paper, but in performance, the stress of their stage fright drives them to a certain level of incomfortability. They feel like, I better get to the end. And well. And I still think that besides the rhythmic beats, spaces of allocated groups of subdivided notes that define a bar, let's say 8/16 notes in 2/4. They're not 9 and they're not 7, right? If you do ritenuto or rubato or accelerando, then it's a question of tasteful derailing and then re-entering in the rails according to an emotional excess or a driven desire to go forward in an anticipation of a sort of a agitato impatience, or then in the contrary, some kind of paced down energy which either merges into a slower section, either it's just a moment of suspended time before you pick up again the traction. If anything, the tempo is defined by the notation, but people who hear music before they read it, if they can read it, of course, they don't hear it by beats, bars, and hemiolas over bar lines or structured unless they're, of course, trained in ear training, solfège, dictation taking. But even so, the example was often the case of ethnomusicologist Bartók in the Balkan Mountains in the very late 19th, very early 20th century, going with rudimentary recording devices of the time to capture the what he foresaw will be the possible extinction of the oral tradition of the folkloric music. So be it they use a lot of uneven rhythms. Once you say that, you say nothing. How uneven, or how not too uneven. And the drummers usually to dance, because all this it was music, but they considered it more as part of their social life of the villages or of the rurality. I mean, it was the weddings, it was the celebrations, the funerals, alas too, but in all cases, it took care of life, some different social events. So if the drummer was drumming 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, and the others played tapa 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 tapa, different instruments, more or less melodic, wind flutes or more or less string instruments, would be able to play fast groups of 16th notes. Tapa 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 tapa. So the notation on dictation of Western-style writing by Bartók defined it in 16th notes. Let's say 7/16 or 5/16, 1 to 1 to 1 to 3, 1 to 1 to 1 to 3, or 1 to 1 to 3, 1, 1. But if you take only the ones, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 to 1 to 1 to 3, not all the longer beats, pulses, are equally long. By a third, by a quarter, by the double, then it becomes 2/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. In other words, the problem comes in the subdivision. You shred in order to organize the spaces, but when you hear them played by the people who don't even read music in this oral tradition, they do it by the sense of pulse. Could be also connected to the lyrics if there is a danced song, Horo in Bulgarian, or Rečenica, held hand dance. And in a very different way, stylized dance like the French overture in the French Baroque 17th, 18th century. That was not always unevenly dotted. Some were double dotted or over dotted, some were just simple dotted. Basically, the dot wasn't really indicated in the notation because it was part of the tradition. In both cases of written out music, very Western European, or oral tradition, very Eastern European, the sense of rhythm and pulse is essential, but is not something that was transmitted by objective notation through centuries, but it was restricted to the circle of a time period. And in fact, when the French King Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, was walking on his gardens or in his court in front of the ballrooms, and they danced to those stylized, choreographed, very stately dances, the minuets, the sarabandes, the allemands, regardless their different origins, but stylized. So the French overture of a Bach partita is a way to say I also can write in the French style. Same thing happens later when Debussy or Ravel write in Spanish style. It's an exercise of genre in style. But of course, the authenticity of Albéniz writing Spanish music versus Ravel, be it half Basque from northern Spain and half Swiss, has some, let's say, bloodline legitimacy, but it's not about genetics. It's more about the cultural appropriation of characteristic situations, of dances, of stately music like the dotted French overture, where the rhythms are ta-dam, ta-da-dam, ta-dam, 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 independent of the steps of the king. And the orchestra of the walking swarm of violinists around him, sort of say, directed from the violin by Lully to all the other violinists, they carried the music according to the king's steps. Therefore, if he stopped on one leg to watch, acknowledge, or try to bring out a member of his court to privilege, or another one, the opposite direction of the elevator, to discredit, and that point, his steps could be two in a row or one very long stop. Ta-dam, ta-da-dam, ta-dam, ta-da-dam, ta-dam. So in fact, all this to say that in different, completely unrelated fields of musical expression, oral tradition, written Baroque, the dotted rhythm, the uneven rhythm are just gimmicks in a way. Because in fact, they're on the surface. What motivates them is more interesting. The tension and the release, the tempo that they create. What is stately tempo in 18th century France? What is stately tempo in Prussia? What is stately tempo in Italy? Nothing but in the Baroque era. Of course, people traveled, but very fewer than most. As a matter of fact, few cross-pollinated Europe, like Froberger from Frescobaldi, through France to back to Germany. But and even so, if Bach heard or saw and read the score of a concerto by Vivaldi, he even totally appropriated it without even quoting its origin when he transformed it, let's say, in a harpsichord concerto, like the four violins for four harpsichords. Homage or learning from the model is like templates. Could be both. Who knows? We assume. In fact, we assume very much of things that we've never witnessed with a proof. Of course, we have plethora of treatises that explained to us how things are supposed to be done from their own time, of course. L'Art de toucher le clavecin by Couperin, and the Versuch, the essay in expressive keyboard music by C.P. Bach, and many more, Muffat, and who knows, don't even know them all, but they insisted for some of them pedagogically on the fact of giving a description of how you're supposed to do the things according to their good taste of the time, area, and region. Because the concept of interpretation versus composition didn't exist. It was a written piece which was read for an occasion or a commission, and then the next. And there was no music in between. The music was cooked like a meal for occasions. That's why the musicians and the cooks in the rich families who could afford were on the same, so to say, level floor socially. And they provided spiritual food for the different occasions of the household of the rich owners, and then the others were serving it for the cooking, the music making, the hunting, organizing all the life of the masters. Yeah, in a way, the musicians were slaves. They either worked for the church in Western Europe, either they were basically poor, because even the church didn't pay much, typically Bach. Or then you had to be a court composer of a famous prince, which was like top of the elite, the beyond, less than top 1%, and politics galore. Well, what has changed, right? But at least the production of music, ephemeral as it was, because not recorded or published or printed, sometimes published, most of the time copied, learned through writing, templates and role models became the way of learning quickly before an unexpected short-term life's death for our standards, mid-30s, early 40s. And so it was more learning and absorbing a know-how for the region of the area of the time period, which had a lot of innuendo in the notation in order to go quickly and use less ink. So in fact, the clefs, it was to avoid ledger lines because it had more room for music on a paper page, which is of course very rare and expensive then. And then ornamentation indications was all codified in order to avoid having to write all these grace notes. I think we make bigger today deal out of it than it is to have the knowledge of how we organize the mordents and the ornaments and the trills and the appoggiaturas and the accacciaturas on the beat, before the beat, around the beat, melodically or stressed, rhythmized or not, finished before the termination or without termination, or just a vague vibrato shaking. I think that, yes, we know from treatises, but we play a different instrument beyond. We have different ears. We have heard dissonances beyond belief compared to then. I always worry if ever they could return, they would be probably traumatized today. The level of dissonances, the level of lack of hierarchy in the lack of tonal system, therefore, they would be probably lost in translation, the greatest composers of the past. I think as universal as they are to us, with their message, narrative, storytelling, dramatic, or whatever, touching our lives in today, our psychological, our inner lives, of course, they're still very embedded inside their own time period. They're music of their own present, meant for that present. And today with conservatories conserving, recordings conserving, publishing conserving, libraries, online datas, we can live by procuration in imagination through music, for instance, in another time period. It's literally time machine. Of course, we outside of that live in today's life with the noises of today, or the speed of today, or the expectations of today's education or economic success. And in every aspect, the world has nothing to do with the one of the music which we play, as if we extract it out of its own reality and we put it in ours only through our inner life, because somehow our soul yearns for that same romantic era when they didn't know it was romantic era, because they only expressed their feelings, their spiritual upliftings, their philosophical meanings of life through music, the rests, the beats, the upbeats, the downbeats, the deceptive cadences, the prolonged articulations, the longer phrasing, the climax or avoiding climax or delaying climax, and then organizing music that speaks without syllables as much to the heart of the people and their soul and thoughts, as well as with lyrics. And I find that the abstract music, like a fugue, compared to the dancing music or the singing music, which is imitative of other genres, or then imitation of nature, and it's beautiful. It turns out that, in fact, if we were to do music like they did in the past, when we play the Chopin, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Schumann, Liszt, and more, and before, but since less, and today very little, because it's such a devastatingly deceptive variety of musical languages, quasi one per composer, that in order to even be able to penetrate on the surface, let us immerse in the musical world of a given composer's language, you have first to learn the alphabet of that language, without which you cannot connect, because you find everything random or possibly aggressive, because it's like a foreign language. You hear the sounds of the phonemes, not their meanings. When you speak the foreign language, you hear the meanings and you hear less the phonemes, unless it's a poem where in the given language the vowels, the consonants, the nasals, the throat sounds, the poetry is about the music of the words, and as well as for their meaning. So it's a chosen word, like a chosen note for a specific mood that creates its effect, releases its emotional or inspirational, intellectual, or spiritually elevating drive. But when you cannot have access to it, you have to first learn the language. Of course, the first one is by ear, the mother tongue, but all the others are by the book. And when you know them well enough, and innuendos in them, and the hints, and the synonymous, and the ironies, and then you enter not only in the meaning of the work, but also in the hints of the work's storytelling. In a way, the plot in the scenario of a film or of a libretto of an opera is easily brought down to an action that can be resumed in a paragraph or two. But all what happens between all these elements of the action or the realization of the situation through an aria, an action through a recitativo, can be a rock opera, baroque opera. Don't try to play on a pun here, but it was too obviously easy. I didn't avoid it. I find that the storytelling is the base of all of that, and I find that fascinating, that we can connect to a storytelling from another time period with a different instrument, even if it's a copy of the original, and even if it's not at all, but is a music instrument for playing music from 2 centuries, built or conceived as an instrument a century ago, like the piano. You still have different length of sounds, therefore different capacities of voicing, structurizing, organizing the balances between the ranges and then the thematic materials, the layered voices. In other words, the culture of your understanding, how you complement the rests, the upbeat, the downbeat, the uneven measure of beats, how your discourse is paced not only by the notated rhythmic patterns, but also by the psychological breathing between phrases, sentences, regrets, hopes, agitation, or perhaps just very calm and peaceful and pacing. I think that notated music played correctly should bring the mood that it's creating through the craftsmanship of its conception. And sometimes I find that we end up by taking a faster tempo, building more of the velocity, excitement. And what's wrong with that? It's a form of seduction or jubilation, or perhaps because of the length of sound that is longer decay today before the decay reaches the note, we can play slower tempi and stretch them more so we can perhaps express in a deeper way what we think is deeper if we play an adagio which was meant andante, but heard as an andante by the composer in his own or her own time period. So today we are sometimes lost in translation between our instruments, but more because of our ears. And mostly because we extract from the music of the past only what matters and means to us, in a way outside of its context. And the music of the past was always the music of their present. Today's music is mostly music of the past, and little the music of the present. Well, mostly because it's mind-boggling, and therefore people give up. Or if it's written in an old-fashioned, long centuries before tonal system, is considered, old-fashioned and uninnovative, unchallenging, unconfronting, unmodern. What if the sincerity, the honesty of the expression of the mood, of the emotion, or the thought of the composer doesn't need per se modernity as such? It could be that it is a vehicle, but it's not necessarily an end by itself. And therefore I think we can have a different tempo today compared to what was expected then, not only because of the instruments and change of times, but mostly because of our perception of what it was. Perhaps we idealize their music, we worship it, and they didn't have perhaps the luxury to do so for their own past. Nobody asked Chopin to play a Scarlatti sonata. They expected he'll play Chopin. Nobody asked Mozart to play a Bach Prelude and Fugue. They expected him to bring a Mozart piece, composed or improvised, and same for all the others, with the exception of Liszt, who started playing colleagues' music and former greats. Hence how we have the recital format today. But today then, the interpreters are not the performers of the pieces that they composed. It's separate. And sometimes it can be bound together and relive anew compared to what it used to be or is supposed to have been, because after all, it's in the eye of the beholder. They didn't leave us in interpretation. The great masters of the past, they left us for the Western tradition of music of the, let's say, last 3 centuries, a notation out of which we make what we want, what we believe, what we are taught, what we learned, what we are instructed, but also what we feel, what we intensely, fiercely need to fulfill some psychological or spiritual or pure fun of velocity or of powerful output of sounds, the grapes of harmonic progressions and the unforgettable perfumes of melodic lines and transcriptions from orchestra to the piano. In other words, ever transformational music. And I find that ultimately we should not be that rigid for the tempo. Choose one, believe in it, try to go through it, and then try to question it after you've played and see which one corresponds to your articulation, your legato, your instrument, your capacity of legato, and then adjust it. It's all about storytelling. I think the tempo is not but storytelling. Perhaps not as we imagine it, but more a psychological innuendo that the pulse and the rhythm give us inside us. And then from there on, like rails on track, we build above.